In today's day and age, we as mastering engineers are very conscious of our ceiling. And now the ceiling is actually becoming a relative thing. But in terms of how we're processing, we're always understanding how our levels are interacting with that ceiling. And we almost work backwards from that place. So we have a gain structure as a starting place set. It has to do with how much heavy lifting the limiter does at the end of the chain. And if you think about it, starting at the end and working backwards, you have a limiter, and then you have a converter, and then you have a compressor, which gives you a certain amount of gain. And then you have a high frequency limiter that doesn't really give you gain, but it shapes the audio. And then you have a compressor, which does alter the gain, and two EQs, which will give you some gain also. So it's one big gain structure. If you plot, you can plot it forwards or backwards. That exists. And we're interacting with the ceiling at zero. How the transients are interacting with that, how hard they sound, how soft they sound, how much space in terms of how much density is below that ceiling. You could end up adding a dB without touching anything else, hypothetically, into that gain structure that's kind of set at the moment. And everything will feel a little bit more compressed. You'll lose the space around the elements a little bit. You might lose the groove, because a song like this, it completely has to do with how it's moving, how the compression is moving in relation to the EQ. And you only want to enhance that musical feel. Does it enhance the groove, or are you losing that groove? These are a big part of our decisions. So level is very important in that. And we have to be within a window of what is expected in a contemporary recording. And there is a window. There's a low side of things and there's a very loud side of things. And we're right in that. We're not too low, so it feels like it doesn't quite get there. And we're not too hot. As long as you're within that window, you're in good shape. Now, the streaming services like Spotify and iTunes, what they're doing is they're leveling everything across the board post the mastering process. Does that influence what we do? Yes and no. It doesn't influence how far we push something in terms of compression, because that's a musical process. Our compression always needs to be part of the musicality. In terms, it does allow you to achieve hotter levels just by default, but it's not a situation where we're intentionally trying to compress to hit a particular type of LUFS level, hypothetically. It's more that we're getting our musical processes in order, our compression for musicality, and being aware in our peripheral vision, if you will, of where that's going to end up in terms of its overall level and loudness at full scale, meaning that it's not being dropped digitally post that process. Now, Spotify and iTunes and these streaming services will do that. They will drop the ceiling, but the ceiling remains intact relative to the audio within that ceiling. You can lower that ceiling, you can raise it back up to zero, you can do anything you want. The musical choices remain the same. So it does influence us because really the loudness wars are over. Nobody needs to go heavy, heavy loud, especially if it's not for musical purposes. It's something that we've never done. Generally speaking, the louder you push something, the more Spotify and these streaming services are going to turn it down. And the worst thing that you could end up with is a loud yet small recording where actually people end up turning it down. If you want something that's going to just light up the room, you want people to turn it up or just hit that volume where it just feels like it expands in the right way, and you're in good shape. And what is that window? The good news is the window is almost irrelevant, because where we end up printing is generally a little bit louder than how far Spotify and iTunes turns it down. It's completely dependent on the mix. Sometimes you have LUFS level at -10, -9, sometimes even as hot as -6 or -5 even. And that always depends on the density and the musicality of the mix. We make loud recordings all the time, but it's for the musical purposes. And generally, it has a lot to do with the way the mix is mixed. So if you're dealing with a mix that's already fairly dense, that has a smaller peak to average ratio, but musically it's working, we'll achieve a great sounding loud master. It's not like we're trying to get it so loud. It's just that it naturally wants to live in a place that is a little louder. So that's a common misconception that I think a lot of people end up getting confused about in the mastering process. If you end up a little louder, if you end up a little softer, it always has to do with where you start and where you want to end up. Spotify is changing what that level is, and they've already done it since they started doing it, to try to anticipate where your music is going to be leveled down, and perhaps trying to hit that mark in the mastering process, for us is ill-advised, because you could end up in a place where you end up having to redo something. Let's also be aware that This is a feature that you can turn on and off within the playback of the application. If you do want to hear everything at full scale, just the way it was done in the mastering process, you can have that ability too. There's also a lot of debate about digitally reducing level in the streaming services, song by song versus a whole album in its entirety. You know, a group of songs and then one little interlude between some songs that has its own start and end ID that might be 20 dB louder than the loudest part of the loudest song on the album. And if you end up not lowering that, you could lose your relativity that is intended by the producer and the artist. So understanding how Spotify is going to level the individual songs versus the global is also something that we need to be aware of. So what goes out to the world is exactly what the artist and the producer intend. Some people have some different opinions on clipping. Digital clipping versus analog to digital clipping. These all have different sounds. Generally speaking, I find that I like to play back the mix just the way the mix was played. I actually don't ever clip it digitally. If I do get into clipping, which I often do, and even on this song I'm lightly clipping the A to D, but it's for musical purposes. Clipping has a sound, a certain texture, a certain control, and it's all part of it, and it gives you a certain life. Pretty heavy-handed sometimes with really hammering an A to D. You can really go wild sometimes with these processes. You can do a whole lot of stuff, and to the end listener, it doesn't sound like you did anything at all. It ends up in this balanced, finished place. So there is really no one way to go about the process. You know, we have our own methods that work for us that people really love. We know how to work in all genres. We do well in, hip hop and EDM music. We do orchestral scores, and all of these different genres, all of these different arrangements, we have different ways of going about how to treat each one. And we understand our clients, we understand the marketplace, we know what is expected of us, and we bring it there. Another thing to talk about is how we go about limiting post-conversion. There's so many options out there, and oftentimes people gravitate or think they want to gravitate towards limiters that are very transparent. Certain types of arrangements, certain types of genres, depending on how we work it in the analog stage versus converting to digital and then limiting post-conversion, you might want something a little more transparent, or you might want something that has a little more hold. I tend to gravitate towards processes that hold information, could kind of envelop a little bit, and it allows me to then EQ into that. I oftentimes don't gravitate towards the most transparent limiters, and I still oftentimes rely on the Waves L2. A lot of people feel that it's not the most transparent limiter, and I like it for that reason. It allows for a little bit of warmth, it's very subtle, and a little bit of low end and low mid hold. In terms of the output ceiling, generally speaking, we'll have the output at -1/10, and that's how we print the file. We can then lower it digitally post. We can add another 1/10 of reduction. Sometimes we do that on certain types of arrangements because we're anticipating how it's going to be then converted from digital to analog on a consumer grade device. Sometimes we won't lower it at all. We'll keep it at 0, and that'll allow for a little bit more impact, especially with 808s, kicks, more aggressive type genres. If you really, really just want it to, hit that consumer grade D to A with a little bit more impact and less window of cushion. Master for iTunes is something that we anticipate for. Now, when you're going to the iTunes store, they have their own codec. It's a Master for iTunes AAC codec. It's a 256 variable bit rate as opposed to a 128 fixed bit rate that was their format before they introduced Mastered for iTunes. It's pretty impressive considering how small that file is and how much of the fidelity is maintained. We don't make the AACs in the mastering process. What we do is we submit a 24-bit high-resolution file, which will then be converted to AAC at Apple. As part of the mastering process for Master for iTunes, we have to anticipate that conversion process. And you have to be aware of where your levels are, anticipating that conversion process to not introduce inter-sample clipping. And generally the way I go about that is by taking the ceiling down. So you have more of a window of air, so to speak, between your peak level and your overall level, anticipating the conversion process. So there's tools out there available. Anybody can have them. There's a particular tool called Droplet. You can literally drop anything, any PCM file into it, and it will generate an AAC, and it'll tell you if you're going to anticipate any inter-sample clipping. This is not necessarily a process that can be always so formulaic. More dense materials will clip a little easier. Stuff that has information closer to 0 could clip a little easier than stuff that maybe is a little more dynamic, where you have your transients hitting close to zero, but the overall average level is below. A mastering engineer will anticipate all of that so that what plays back on the iTunes store is the best representation of the work. So mastering a single is much different than mastering an album. When we're mastering an album, we have to be very aware of how all the songs within the project are going to live together as this completed work, as an entire canvas, if you will. Project that's tracked in the same environment, maybe in the same room with similar musicians, maybe all at once, mixed in the same environment by the same engineer. We'll go about mastering that process a little bit differently than if we're mastering a compilation or a greatest hits or a soundtrack where we have to marry an orchestral score with some pop songs. All of this different material can live together as one process. So a good mastering engineer, before they even start the work, will size up all the songs together, get a feel, and understand how all of this material is going to live in a finished place that feels like a finished product. Now, how do we go about that? If we're dealing with material that's a little bit here and there in terms of what's being presented to us before we touch anything at all, maybe we're dealing with a whole bunch of material that's very dense, that people went through a whole bunch of compression, maybe on the individual elements of the mix and also globally through bus compression, maybe even some limiting, maybe even doing a mastering process in the digital domain before even introducing, even being presented to us. And then we just take it to that place of, we don't have much room to work, but that's maybe okay as long as it feels good musically. We just give it that final bloom that texturally feels good, and also anticipating how it's going to be played back on all these various devices. So we are very aware of how we can treat something like that. But maybe we need to marry that material with some other stuff that's very dynamic, you know? We'll end up printing the more compressed material a little bit under how we might print it if it was just a single, because we're anticipating how it's going to live with other material that's more dynamic. Sometimes we might end up leaning a tiny bit heavier in terms of how we process the dynamic material, anticipating how it's going to live with the more dense material. But you never want to create a situation where you're losing the musicality. You can move things within a window as long as it's just as good printed a little hotter as it's printed a little less hot, and you don't lose any of the musicality, you're only enhancing, you're in good shape. You have a window to work within. So as we're dealing with various types of mix balances, various types of genres, and creating a compilation album, if you will, we have to take that all into account so we can create this global end result that feels like it all belongs. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a window into our world, how we go about dealing with various types of arrangements, various types of genres, and how it's all interrelated. And at the end of the day, it's always about the music. The music comes first. And in this case, you gotta feel happy.